Every week, it's our goal to share financial information that helps you in both your life and financial vineyard. We hope it takes you from your roots to the journey of your vines and the influences in the air that help craft your delicious life. Like wine and finances have different palates that should be celebrated and not judged. Welcome to this edition of Wine and Dime with Amy Irvine and Kerrie Beene, where we continue this month's theme of love, money, and emotion. And there's lots of emotion around money. And Kerrie and I could probably talk for hours and hours and hours on this particular topic. We've done classes on the psychology of money, money in couples. She and I have had extremely deep conversations around money and how we grew up around money and how emotionally we are around money. So it's always great to talk about this topic with you, Kerrie. I know we're recording on a Friday, and I know you're doing some traveling. Any thoughts on the type of wine you might have tonight as you settle in after a crazy, crazy week that you've had?
Actually, there's a bottle of a red blend. It's just, I think it says winemaker's blend, actually, sitting on my island in my house. So when I get home this evening after another ball game, I think I'll be having a glass of that. And I can't remember the brand. I was actually at Olive Garden recently and just bought the bottle instead of the glass. So
I love it. Efficiency of scale there. Efficiency of scale. Yeah. Yes. I actually have a Mark West Pinot Noir that I'm going to be drinking tonight. That's sitting out on the counter from me. So looking forward to having a glass of that. If you listen to the podcast, whenever I'm recording on Friday, I'm like, it's been a week. I'm thinking, people are going to think like it's always been a week with you, Amy. I think I just look forward to Friday so much, and I really enjoy usually 2 glasses of wine on Friday. Like I'll have to admit, but
well, the 24-hour news feed and the constant financial information that comes out, it's a lot. So yeah.
Well, in the past, couple of weeks in the month so far this year has been a bit on the hefty side of data, I guess you want to say. So one of the things that I thought would be really interesting for you and I to talk about, especially because we've been working with some clients that have had some really big financial goals that they've been planning for, whether it's to buy a house or to relocate or to pay for their kids' education. And you certainly are experiencing that personally. But removing the emotion from those large financial decisions, right? It's tough. I mean, if your kid gets into a school that's their first choice, there's a lot of emotion behind that. And there's sometimes some financial consequences. And we're certainly not saying don't do it, but the emotion is what's driving the decision, not the financial consequences necessarily. But I thought it would be good for us to chat a little bit about that and to maybe come up with 3 different things that people can do that would help them sort of take a step back and make the decision with the financial hat on, knowing how it will also affect them emotionally, but just be aware that there needs to be a disconnect a little bit, right? On some of that stuff.
Yeah.
Thinking about that and thinking about the clients that we've worked with, where would you start when a big financial decision is being analyzed with a client? Of course, I'm going to make a shameless plug here, right? If you have a big financial decision to make, we'd love to help you with that. Shameless plug. Financial advisors don't have the emotion attached to the actual goal that you have. So we can look at it and analyze it purely from the economic perspective. You may or may not elect to follow us, but at least you know the consequences, right? So as a financial planner, when somebody comes to you and says, I'm thinking about doing this, what's the first step that you're actually going to sit down and talk to them about?
I think the first step should be obviously figuring out the true cost of it. So I think there's a lot. I'm in a phase of life where I do have a lot of big decisions going on and expensive decisions, maybe I should say, because my daughter recently, she's a freshman in college. So walking through that decision on where to go and how to pay for it was a big process for us, especially because we've taught our kids to dream big. And when they're little, that's easy to say. And I never wanted them to be intimidated by going to a bigger school. But then when you get ready to actually make the decision and figure out how to pay for it, it's easy to like forget, oh, we were so emotional when we were doing all these college tours and this college was great and that college was great. But what is the actual true cost of it? So figuring out, and a lot of the colleges do have that information on their websites, figuring out what it's actually going to cost to go, tuitions, books, fees, room and board, dining expenses, meal plans, things like that. Figuring that out, and then walking through the process of applying and figuring out what scholarships you're going to get, and then, what scholarships you're not going to get, and then how do you pay for it, and figuring out, okay, is this a good idea? Because I think a lot of people don't walk through that process and they just take the student loans on, and then they walk out at the end with a big student loan payment, and it affects their lives for a really long time. So taking the time to do the true cost evaluation and making that decision on, can I actually afford this, and what is my life and cash flow going to look like later?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think knowing, like you said, the word consequences, I think that's a really big piece of it. It's not that sometimes I think, people will look at it and say, well, you're saying don't go there. And that's not what we're saying at all. Like, we're not saying don't buy that house, or we're not saying don't buy a second house, or don't send your kid to that college. What we're saying is, here's the facts. When we look at the spreadsheet that we prepare in some situations, and the bottom line is, this is what it's going to do to your overall plan, or this is how it's going to affect your overall plan. We're not saying don't do it. We're saying be aware of how, it's going to change your plan, and then retool your plan from there. Right. So let's say it's buy a second house. Okay. So I really want to buy a second house in an area, and maybe I'm going to rent that out a little bit. Maybe I'm not, it doesn't really matter. But how does that affect your plan? Because now you have an additional expense that was not part of your cash flow before. It's your dream. So we're of course not going to say, don't do it. What we're going to say is, this is how it affects your plan. It is what it is. It's going to be incorporated. Here's maybe some areas that you would want to consider exchanging, I think is a good word. Like, you were spending money this way. Now you want to spend money that way. So it's just knowing those consequences. And then I think, you have said in the past, I've heard you say, it's also taking a look at the big picture and saying, well, what other crazy things are going to be coming up? And I know recently you were talking to me about cars in your household.
Mm-hmm.
You have,
mm-hmm.
You're going to have 4 drivers. Look at you.
Yeah.
Your cars are paid
boy.
for. So it's awesome. Your cars are paid for. Like, you don't have that debt that you're paying, but eventually you're going to have to start thinking about replacement vehicles.
Yes.
So
the timing of it is not going to be well for us, because my husband and I both are driving paid for vehicles, but the mileage on them and the wear and tear is really starting to get up there, and they're going to be okay for a little while, but the timing of it is going to be right probably as my son is graduating and possibly leaving for college, and he's going to need a better vehicle to drive too. So all of a sudden we're going to have 3 vehicles that need replaced. And so figuring out, what can we do now while we don't want to replace our vehicles right now, but what is something we can do today to maybe lessen the burden of what's going to happen to us in a few years. Just figuring out our cash flow and our strategy on that.
Even the type of vehicle, right? So again, here's another, vehicles can be a very emotionally driven financial decision. I am all about the safety and visual, like the ability to see out of a vehicle. So I have to have what I would call a girly SUV. I don't need a big SUV. I don't, but I just need to have a little elevation so that I can see, and I need to have really good ability to have some clearance. which does limit, the options that I have available to me. But when I hate car shopping, by the way, I don't know about how you feel about it. Now,
Yeah.
you're very good at the analysis behind it. I've seen that. Like, I saw what you put together with Raylan and her decision in car buying options. But for me, I loathe getting a new car. I absolutely loathe it. So first I go into it emotionally like, ugh, and I want to spend the least amount of money that I possibly can spend on this depreciating asset that is a necessity in my life, right? So I go into it with already this sort of negative connotation in my head of like, ugh. But safety is really important. So I do want to have some safety features thrown into there. And when you look at the cost of those, you're going to be spending at least $35,000 if you buy brand new. And right now, buying used is worse than buying brand new. But historically, we used to say buy like a vehicle that's just a couple years old. And for some people, that made absolute sense. But for other people, especially if you're thinking about like a money psychology of self-esteem, they want the newest vehicle, the newest bells and whistles, and they want it about every 3 years, where I'm like forced into it about every 10 years. But that's something that's, when you think about like your decision around buying a car, if your kids are going to be driving it, safety is probably going to be your number one priority,
Right.
and you're willing to pay for that. And then thinking about you and Alan, like, yes, it's also safety, but it's also, you have to have some clearance because of where you guys live. And you've got some restrictions on some of that stuff too. And so, what are some of the things that you can start to do now, knowing that this perfect storm is going to be happening in 2 to 3 years?
Right. I think, our first big point was true cost. Okay, well, now we've figured out true cost. The second thing that you really need to do is cash flow. How are you going to be able to fund these goals? And some of them are conflicting goals. And I feel like I'm in the biggest phase of my life with some big conflicting goals right now, just with the cars and the college and the kids and everything. So I think walking through, once you have your true cost, sort of walking through your cash flow and what can you afford. And it is really, and everyone's different, but monitoring your emotions, it is very exciting to see your kid go to college and, potentially get them a vehicle and things like that. So it's really easy to get caught up in it and not think about your cash flow and your finances, but that can have really long-term effects if you don't think about it. So monitoring the cash flow and knowing how it's going to affect it. Sorry.
Yeah. And then I also think sometimes, I was joking earlier and I said a shameless plug, but I also do think sometimes it's important to step off your own porch, as I say, and go look at it from a different angle. So if you're talking about the situation with your household and needing the 3 vehicles potentially and starting to save for it from a cash flow perspective, if you take off the Kerrie and Alan Beene hat and what's right in your household, and you put on the financial planner or neighbor hat, I guess you want to say, like standing and viewing it from another porch, what would it look like, or what would be some of the things that you would emotionally say is different from that perspective? Like, it's what I call the parental advice. Like, what would your dad say to you? Like, I'm not saying that he might say what, but what would it, it's almost like you're judging yourself in a way, I guess is the way I'm trying to put it. Like, it's always so easy to stand back and say, well, if that'd been me, I would have done that. But when, it's really easy to do that, right? It's so easy. But when it's your own decision, like, of course you're not going to say that. But if you were to take a moment, like take a breath and sort of judge yourself from a perspective like that, I think that that's always very helpful, because when you think, how could I, if you think about the situation in the future and say, well, if that were my friend, I would suggest this. So it's not me, it's not my decision, but if that were my friend, or if that's I would say it with siblings, like if that were my brother, or that were your brother, or that were your sister, like what would you sort of judge, differently from that perspective? And I think that's very helpful sometimes. I mean, in your situation, you're looking at funding things now. You're looking out 2 to 3 years from now and saying, well, we better start funding this right now because we have the perfect storm coming up. But, that was you guys recognizing it. Are there, there might be other things that come up that I think it can require just some different perspective. I guess that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. I think the one thing when it's easier, and I think you said, like from your neighbor's porch and I was actually just thinking about this yesterday and this morning, because I was thinking, well, there's probably some things in our budget or cash flow that we're paying for right now that we could probably get rid of. And if I were looking at it from a perspective of someone else's cash flow, I'd be like, well, why don't you cut this, this, and this? Okay, well, that's really easy to say. But when you're on the receiving end of the cutting, you're like, oh, but I really want to keep doing that, and for us having teenagers, there's a few, I was thinking, we've got some different streaming services and things like that. I'm like, we probably have too many. We could get rid of a few of those. And not that those are huge difference makers, but when you do a whole lot of little things and they start adding up and they just kind of creep up on you, that's probably how I would currently judge myself. Like I would say, okay, let's cut these 3 to 5 things and, be surprised at what it will help your cash flow.
If it adds up to $100, it's $100, I mean, that's $100 a month. Yeah. Yeah. And you're very good. I mean, I know I've seen your beautiful spreadsheets. So for you, it would be able to go down through those spreadsheets and probably tick off some of those items that you would say, save for a new car versus this. I think it's identifying where you're currently at. It sort of goes back to our whole process of when we're working with clients, right? And that starting out with a financial audit on a particular topic and saying, well, this is where you're at right now, and this is where you want to be. Like, what are some of the things small changes that we need to make? And I do strongly believe that small changes are so much more palatable than massive changes. We just, in January on the podcast, we talked about New Year's resolutions and checking in on New Year's resolutions and how New Year's resolutions can be successful. And it's when small changes happen over long periods of time that you can achieve some of the goals that you set. So I think your point is extremely valid. Anything that you would recommend to the listeners, anything specific that you would recommend to the listeners that would be 1 or 2 steps that would help them sort of take that step back when it comes to emotional decisions?
I think recognizing your emotions when you're in the moment before you make the decision, recognize this is an emotional decision and a financial decision. So just thinking through, okay, how do I remove my emotions and analyze the financial piece of it? Because some of those emotions in the beginning of a decision are joy. Oh, this is fun. Oh, this is great feeling. But sometimes the emotion you have after the decision can be a bad emotion because it's affected your cash flow in a way that's causing stress. So just recognizing this is a big decision and a piece of it is emotional, and how do I analyze and make the right decision in recognizing the emotion?
So recognize the emotion first, then recognize the financial consequence second, and then look at the two together.
And then maybe walk through those steps, the true cost, the cash flow. Is this a situation where I should pull in a resource like a financial planner? So, yeah.
Well, Kerrie, those are great tips. I think that if people take a few moments to sort of think that through, recognizing the emotion separate from recognizing the financial, and then taking a step back and saying, okay, what's the true cost? What's the cash flow? How would this be financed? And then am I too emotionally connected that I still can't make that decision? Do I need to bring in a professional to help guide me through this process? I think those are great tips. And, I always say at the end of every podcast, like, we hope that the listeners get a lot out of us having these jam sessions, and to share it with friends, like on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, all that sort of stuff. But I'm also saying, we have that section in our newsletter that's asking for a friend. And when you listen to these podcasts, we would love it if a question comes up in your head around this particular topic, or any topic, that is like, I have a big decision, like, what would you suggest? And we will include those questions in our newsletter. We will not disclose names or anything like that. It'll be a general question. So we'd love to hear if you have any specific questions around this topic, or again, any topic around money and finance, because we do feel like this is important to educate folks around these topics. And sometimes people, that's why we call it, we did the play on asking for a friend, because sometimes people feel like they should know about money, and like we were born to know about money, and we weren't. And there's no shame in asking questions around any of this stuff. And, if you listen to us talk sometimes in team meetings and with each other, we as financial planners have the same exact emotional connection between money and spending, and security or insecurity that you as listeners have. And so we're not going to judge anything around this particular topic, but that's why we sometimes come to each other to talk about these topics, because we know that we're too emotionally connected to something, and want to make sure that we're being rational at the same time around the decisions, and that there isn't unthought of consequences. Not that you would intentionally do that, but sometimes we can just see those sort of moving targets from a different angle, from the 500-foot view versus the 2-inch view. Well, we appreciate you all listening. As I mentioned, please feel free to share this podcast and with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, all those sources. Feel free to reach out to Kerrie or I. Our contact information is going to be in the show notes. We hope you enjoy this series that we've been running this month in February around love and belonging, and loving money, and love and emotion, and all of that sort of stuff. And if you do have questions, feel free to send it, ask for a friend, and we will happily provide your question to our other readers. We hope you all enjoyed this podcast.
And that will about do it for today's episode of Wine and Dine. You can contact Amy through the website, www.rootedpg.com, or amy@rootedpg.com. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram @rootedpg for the latest news. And if you have any questions, comments, or topics you would like to hear about, feel free to let us know. And don't forget to rate and subscribe the show wherever you get your podcasts. And again, thank you for listening, and be sure to tune in next time.